Welcome to the Vermont Retain training module on readiness to work and COVID-19. My name is Phyllis Phillips. I am an educational consultant to Vermont Retain, and I will be your guide through the following presentation on safely and successfully returning your employees to work post-COVID. Knowledge is power, so my very strong suggestion is to listen up and gain some of both. And because I'm a lawyer, I feel the need to start with the following disclaimer. First, I'm required to tell you that Vermont Retain is fully funded by a grant from the U.S. Department of Labor. Second, I need you to know that while this presentation provides information on best practices and includes a discussion of general legal concepts, it is not intended to provide legal advice. So if you have specific questions or concerns, I urge you to consult your attorney before taking action. Please, I'm begging. So what is Vermont Retain, you ask? It stands for Retaining Employment and Talent After Injury and Illness Network. I know, rolls right off the tongue, huh? Simply put, Vermont Retain helps employers, employees, medical providers, and other stakeholders figure out ways to keep people who are injured or ill from becoming disabled. We do this in large part by educating people about why staying at work is so important, both for themselves and for their employers. The COVID-19 shutdown has presented formidable challenges for all of us. The prospect of reopening and getting back to work provides some much needed light at the end of the tunnel. So let's get started. In this training module, I'm going to talk about 4 things. First, I'm going to explain why planning for return to work is so important for both you and your employees. Second, I'm going to explain why the COVID-19 pandemic has presented some special challenges to the return to work process, again, for both you and your employees. Third, I will talk about some non-COVID return to work risk factors. And last, I will address some risk factors that are specific to the COVID pandemic. When I'm done, hopefully you will have learned why it's important to plan for return to work, the resources that Vermont Retain has to offer you, best practices for navigating both non-COVID and COVID-related return to work issues, and where to go if you need more information or assistance. Let's talk about some big picture concepts first. One of the most important concepts is the need to stay informed. The key to success in business is to think ahead, anticipate change, and strategize how best to adapt. Be proactive, not reactive. This is particularly true as it relates to COVID. Here, the landscape is constantly changing, both medically and legally. Doctors are learning more about containing and treating the virus. Lawyers and judges are striving to protect employees from illness without making discriminatory assumptions about what they can and cannot do. As an employer, your safest course is to follow best practices, as these are most likely to keep your employees safe while staying on the right side of the law. To help you do this, the CDC, U.S. Department of Labor, EEOC, and Vermont Departments of Health and of Labor all offer valuable information and resources. You should check in with their websites frequently. Another big picture concept is the need to maintain the confidentiality of your employees' medical information. As we will discuss later, here, COVID has changed the rules a bit. Actions that you would not normally be allowed to take, such as asking about an employee's health or taking their temperature, are currently allowed. But remember, the information you obtain, be it a temperature log or a symptom checklist, is considered a medical record. You must maintain its confidentiality and keep it separate from your employee's personnel file. These are challenging times for both employers and employees. As you embark on the return to work process, listen well, be flexible in your response, and create an environment where your employees feel both physically and emotionally safe. Moving on to some more specific reopening and return to work issues, let's talk first about the effect that being unemployed may have had on your employees. Unemployment is not just a financial issue. It's a physical, emotional, and social issue as well. Unemployment is associated with an increased risk of deconditioning, heart disease, depression, substance use, divorce, and even suicide. Why should you care? Because when your employees come back to work after being unemployed for a time, these factors may cause them to be less productive and more prone to injury. The more aware you can be, the better, for both you and them. Okay, Let's dive into some return to work frequently asked questions. The first question is, are my employees physically out of shape now when it comes to doing their jobs? The answer is likely yes, especially for employees in physically demanding jobs. Most of us have been less active during the COVID shutdown. We've gotten away from our normal routines. We've binge watched bad TV, 2 words, Tiger King. We've been sleeping less and eating more. And with deconditioning comes a greater risk of injury. So what's an employer to do? Plenty. Although you can't ask your employee directly about a non-COVID medical condition, you can and should offer general assistance. How can we help? And please reach out are great messages to send to all of your employees, whether via email blasts or flyers or an announcement over the PA. We also suggest that you provide your employees with the Vermont Retain Readiness to Work checklist to help them understand and identify their own return to work risk factors. Be sure they understand that this is a self-assessment tool. It's for them to complete on their own, and they need not share it with you unless they feel comfortable doing so. Beyond that, and especially with your more physically demanding jobs, the safest bet is probably to start slowly. Assign lighter tasks and maybe fewer hours at first, then gradually move up to normal work duties. A brief pre or mid-shift group stretch is a great physical exercise. It also helps instill a we're all in this together team building attitude and typically provides a few laughs as well. And be aware, take notice if an employee seems to be struggling through a job task and ask how you can help. The next question can be particularly concerning. What should you do if you suspect that an employee has developed a mental health or substance use problem while out of work? Here again, although you cannot ask an employee directly about their mental health or substance use, there are still ways you can help. Offer the Vermont Retain Readiness to Work checklist so they can assess for themselves whether they have a problem. Publicize your substance use policy. Post information about available resources, and if an employee asks, offer assistance with accessing them. But in a more general vein, consider the environment you've created. Be honest. Is this a place where your employees will likely feel comfortable coming to you with such problems? Think compassion, not judgment, and performance, not punishment. For example, if you suspect that an employee who has been uncharacteristically sluggish at work lately may be struggling with an alcohol problem, the right approach is not, your eyes are always bloodshot lately. What, are you hungover? Instead, it's, I'm noticing you've been having a hard time keeping up with your workload lately. That's a problem for both of us, so let's talk about what we can do to fix it. The next question is, how do I respond to new and existing job accommodations? While out of work during the COVID shutdown, some of your employees may have developed new or worsening medical conditions. To ensure these employees' safety, you should reevaluate both their jobs and any accommodations you had been offering previously to make sure they're still appropriate. Make sure also your employees know if any job tasks have changed and invite them to tell you if that's problematic in any way. Here again, the Vermont Retain Readiness to Work checklist for both employers and employees may help you identify problem areas and brainstorm solutions. As for what help is available if your employee is struggling with mental health or substance use issues, this last slide provides you with some valuable resources. If you have your own employee assistance program, reassure your employees as to its confidential nature and make sure they know how to access it. If you don't have your own program, Invest EAP is a good resource for both you and your employees. The Vermont Department of Health has a list of resources as well. Again, although you cannot confront an employee directly with questions about their mental health or substance use, that doesn't mean you should ignore the red flags. Nobody is immune from these conditions, so do your best to make sure all employees are aware of and have access to the available resources. Let's turn now to return to work issues specific to COVID-19. The first question is, when it comes to stay at work and return to work, what's so special about COVID-19? In some ways, nothing. Your employees are both your most valuable and your most expensive asset. So it is always to your benefit to keep them safe, healthy, and on the job. That means ensuring that they have access to prompt, effective medical care when they're injured or ill, and being proactive and flexible when it comes to keeping or returning them to work. But in some ways, COVID is totally different. COVID affects your entire workforce in a way that no back or knee injury ever would. It's highly contagious. It requires uniform precautions throughout your business, including both employees and customers. And if it spreads, it's likely to impact all facets of your operation. And unlike other illnesses or injuries, when an employee tests positive for COVID, staying at work is not an option. All the more reason to focus on prevention. So let's talk about prevention. The question is, do we all have to wear face masks while at work? And who pays for them? The answer is yes, whenever you and your employees are around others. You must also take other precautions, all of which I'm sure you're familiar with by now. Practice social distancing, disinfect surfaces and touch points, wash your hands, discourage large groups, and restrict sharing, especially of food. No potlucks, at least for the time being. As for who pays, if your employees require medical-grade N95 masks, you must provide them at no cost. The cloth masks that we've all become accustomed to wearing, you can leave up to your employees. Though to ensure everyone's safety, including visitors or customers, it's probably a good idea to keep some on hand. The next question is, what if my employee flaunts social distancing or repeatedly forgets to wear her face mask? Can I fire her? The answer is, theoretically, perhaps, if you can show that you are acting consistently and imposing the same severe punishment on others for the same violation. But that's an extreme response. A better approach is to focus on educating and training your employees so they understand how vitally important these measures are in terms of protecting not just themselves, but their families, their friends, and whomever else they come in contact with. As you would with other safety violations, consider a graduated range of responses, from mild, for example, a verbal reminder, to moderate, perhaps a written warning, to severe, maybe even suspending them for the rest of the workday. And again, as with any disciplinary action, always document the actions you take and always respond consistently. And if yours is a union shop, you must always act in accordance with your collective bargaining agreement. Moving on to temperature checks, symptom inquiries, and testing. The first question is, can I require daily temperature checks and symptom review? What about COVID testing? This is an area where the COVID pandemic allows for some extraordinary measures. For example, while the pandemic is ongoing, you can measure your employee's body temperature. This is in effect a medical exam, which under ordinary circumstances, as an employer, you could never do. You can ask whether your employees are experiencing COVID symptoms, such as the ones listed here. And as we learn more about the virus, there may be other symptoms as well. So you should check in regularly with the CDC or Vermont Department of Health websites for the most current information. And again, these are questions that are specific to COVID and cannot ordinarily be asked of your employees. You can require COVID testing, but only if you can ensure that the tests are reliable and accurate. Again, the CDC, Vermont Department of Health, and also the FDA websites are a good resource here. Don't buy one on eBay. And keep in mind, testing does not provide complete protection, so you should still enforce the preventive measures we discussed earlier throughout your facility, regardless of how widespread and frequent your testing has been. Last, you should take care not to target individual employees for temperature checks, symptom review, or testing. Rather, you should implement all of the protocols you develop uniformly. And remember, these are medical records you're creating, so keep a log of results and protect confidentiality as you would any other employee medical record. The next question is, should I tell coworkers if an employee tests positive for COVID? The answer is yes, both for contact tracing and for symptom monitoring purposes, but exercise discretion. This should not be an email blast to all of your employees throughout the state. Rather, it should be directed to those employees with whom the affected individual may have come in contact. Err on the side of caution, but don't just assume that everybody needs to know. And keep in mind that unless the affected employee allows you to disclose their identity, you must maintain their confidentiality. The next question is, what about new hires? Can I screen them for COVID? Here again, the COVID pandemic has caused some of the rules to change. After making a conditional job offer, rather than sending the applicant to a doctor for a medical exam, you can screen them for COVID symptoms yourself, so long as you do so consistently for all applicants. and you can delay the applicant's start date or even withdraw your job offer if they exhibit symptoms or test positive. However, you may encounter an applicant who is over 65 or pregnant, or who suffers from a medical condition that the CDC has determined puts them at higher risk for severe illness should they test positive for COVID. After making a conditional job offer, you cannot just assume that a person in one of these categories is therefore unsuitable for the job. Thus, you cannot delay their start date or withdraw your job offer on those grounds unless a doctor determines, by way of an individualized medical assessment, that taking the job would pose a direct threat to their health that cannot be addressed by a reasonable accommodation. The next question is, under what circumstances should I prohibit an employee from coming to work on account of COVID? Currently, you should prohibit an employee from coming to work if they exhibit COVID-like symptoms, if they test positive for COVID, assuming an accurate and reliable test, and/or if they are required to quarantine at home in accordance with CDC and Vermont Department of Health guidelines. But as to the last, the rules with regard to quarantining after out-of-state travel have been changing frequently, so you should check in often with the Vermont Department of Health website for the most current information and restrictions. The last question in this section is, my employee is very anxious about bringing COVID home to his family. What should I do? Treat your employee as you would like to be treated yourself. Take whatever steps you can to allay their concerns. Perhaps the employee can be reassigned to a less populated workspace or a quieter shift with fewer co-employees or customers. Perhaps they might benefit from additional personal protective equipment. Perhaps they need reassurance that you are committed to enforcing the preventive measures you've implemented, such as social distancing and mask wearing among all employees. Have a conversation, make sure they feel heard, and show that you care. And if you need additional incentive, keep in mind that if the employee's anxiety reaches the point where a doctor determines that they are unable to work, this may form the basis for a compensable work-related stress claim under Vermont's workers' compensation law. This is a result no employer should want. Let's move now to what happens if your employee tests positive. The first question is COVID-19 covered by workers' compensation? The answer is maybe. As with any claimed work-related injury, the general rule is that an employee who contracts the COVID virus must prove that they became infected as a consequence of their job. To do so, the employee will need a credible medical opinion establishing work as not just a possible source of their infection, but as the probable source. However, recently passed legislation in Vermont should make it easier for so-called frontline workers, such as firefighters, police officers, and healthcare workers, to obtain workers' compensation coverage if they become infected. The same may be true for workers who test positive for the virus within 14 days after documented occupational exposure. In legalese, the new law creates a presumption in favor of workers' compensation coverage that shifts the burden of proof from the employee to the employer. Employees who fit under the new law's protective umbrella will no longer have to prove that they probably got the virus while working. Instead, it will be up to the employer to prove that they probably got it somewhere else and not at work. This may be very difficult to do. The next question is, what other safety nets are available to my out-of-work employees? If your employee becomes infected with the COVID virus, they can draw their accrued sick, vacation, or personal leave time. Furloughed or laid off employees will likely qualify for unemployment benefits, and at least through July 31st, 2020, the Federal CARES Act will supplement the state's benefit with an additional $600 per week, regardless of how much the employee was earning before. Short-term disability benefits may be available if that's a benefit you offer, but policies differ as to waiting periods, typically 7 to 14 days, and coverage, for example, for sick as opposed to quarantined employees. It's a good idea to become familiar with the terms of the policy you offer so you can be ready if your employees have questions. If you regularly employ 15 or more employees, Vermont's family medical leave law may be an option. It provides up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave per year. And last, the federal Family First Coronavirus Relief Act offers up to 80 hours of paid sick leave and an additional 10 weeks of paid family or medical leave under certain circumstances. For example, if your employee can't work because childcare services are unavailable. Small employers may qualify for an exemption from this law. So for more information about that, the U.S. Department of Labor website is a good resource. Turning to the next section, my employee has recovered. Now what? The first question is, what should I do before allowing my employee to return to work? First, and hopefully you're familiar with this process from managing your pre-COVID injured or ill employees, the best practice is to make sure that your employee's doctor has cleared them to return to work, either with or without restrictions. And so that there is no misunderstanding or miscommunication, you should get that in writing. And until you have that medical clearance in hand, you should not allow your employee to return to the workplace. Once your employee is released to return to work, you should have a conversation with them to see how they're feeling, both physically and emotionally. They may be deconditioned or anxious about being around others after so much time at home, or they might be ready and raring to go. Check in and find out, then take the appropriate steps to make their transition back to work a smooth and safe one. The next question is, what precautions should I take for employees who are at high risk for severe illness if they get COVID? This is a tough situation. The CDC has identified certain characteristics and conditions that seem to put people at higher risk for severe illness should they be exposed to the COVID virus. On the one hand, as an employer, you want to protect your employees. On the other, you can't make assumptions about what your employees can and cannot do based solely on this type of generalization. Admittedly, it's a fine line. So, if an employee in a high-risk category requests a reasonable accommodation prior to returning to work, for example, being reassigned to a quieter shift with less customer contact, you should consider it. If you can grant the request without undue hardship to your business operation, you should do so. If you think an alternative solution might be better for everyone, you should suggest it. Have a conversation, not an argument. But if the employee does not request an accommodation, you cannot preclude them from returning to work solely because they're in a high-risk category. As in the case of new hires, to do that, you will need a doctor to determine, based on an individualized assessment, that returning to work poses a direct threat to their health that cannot be alleviated by any reasonable accommodation. I hope that through this training module, you've learned some best practices that will help you navigate the process of returning your employees to work post-COVID safely and successfully. If you have additional questions or need more information, please reach out to Vermont Retain, either by phone or email. Our readiness to work checklists are available now, and additional return to work training modules will be coming soon. We can help you access other resources as well. And for more COVID-specific guidance, the websites on your screen offer helpful information at both the federal and state level. Thanks for listening, and stay well.